In the final black minutes before dawn, when the Strait of Hormuz was still a ribbon of steel-colored water between sleeping coastlines, the first Iranian radar crews thought they were seeing clutter. Heat shimmer. Sea return. Electronic ghosts. Then the screens began to bloom all at once. Offshore, beneath the horizon and beyond the confidence of fixed batteries, a 5,000-strong American strike package was already in motion, silent, layered, and moving with the kind of precision that only appears when the order has been debated for months and executed in seconds. What happened next did not unfold like a battle. It unfolded like a system failure so sudden, so violent, that entire sectors of the IRGC coastal missile network went dark before some commanders even understood they were under attack. For years, the narrow throat of the Persian Gulf had been the pressure point of the global economy. A few miles of navigable water. A handful of islands. Oil tankers, LNG carriers, naval escorts, fishing dhows, commercial traffic, all funneled through a maritime choke point within range of layered Iranian missiles, drones, fast attack craft, and hardened command bunkers dug into rock and concrete along the coast. The threat was never just the launchers themselves. It was the architecture behind them, the mobile anti-ship missile batteries hidden inside tunnel mouths, the coastal surveillance radars nested on elevated ridgelines, the underground fuel stores, the fiber-linked command cells, the overlapping launch authorities designed to keep one destroyed site from blinding the next. As long as those systems stood intact, the strait was never merely open water. It was a trigger under permanent tension. And Tehran had built that tension deliberately. In this fictional scenario, days of escalating confrontation had pushed regional forces to the edge. Tankers were rerouting. Insurance markets were surging. Satellite images showed missile carriers repositioning near key firing sectors, while IRGC naval detachments dispersed fast boats into coves and inlets along the southern coast. Hardened sites near the approaches to the strait, camouflaged inside coastal escarpments and reinforced with decoys, were believed to be moving from deterrent posture toward launch readiness. If those batteries fired in coordination, even a brief disruption could send energy prices into chaos, trap shipping, and invite a wider war on a timetable chosen by Iran. The danger was not theoretical anymore. It had become geometric, measured in angles, ranges, and minutes. Then came the reversal, the moment the defenders lost the psychological high ground they had spent years constructing. Iran's coastal doctrine depended on the belief that any attacker would have to fight inward through layers of sensors, batteries, maritime pickets, and militia screens. But that confidence was built around a conventional picture. Visible escalation, airstrikes first, naval bombardment next, signatures accumulating in sequence. Instead, the opening blow shattered the sequence itself. Before major detonations were seen, command traffic began to fragment. Relay stations dropped. Microwave links stuttered. Two separate IRGC sectors received contradictory threat reports, one warning of a naval feint, another of inland sabotage, a third insisting the interference was temporary. In less than 4 minutes, the defenders were no longer looking at a coherent battlefield. They were looking at pieces of one. At the center of the assault was a joint task force built around elite American direct action units, but magnified far beyond a small raid. The title says Marine Raiders and Delta Force, and in this fictional operation they formed the cutting edge, assault leaders, target exploitation teams, terminal guidance elements, and kill confirmation cells, embedded within a much larger framework of naval special warfare detachments, electronic warfare support, long-range fires coordination teams, combat, aviation crews, and maritime interdiction elements. The 5,000 figure was not a single-massed infantry wave charging a beach. It was a machine of distributed violence. Ships over the horizon, aircraft above the weatherline, submarines in the deep lanes, helicopters skimming dark water, drones hunting emitters, cyber teams strangling networks, and small ground units tasked with cutting out the nerve centers that made the missile belt function. Weeks before the first assault package launched, the mission had already begun in shadows. Intelligence mapped the missile ecosystem in layers. Commercial shipping patterns were studied to understand what Iranian observers expected to see and when. Signal specialists watched for radar routines, maintenance cycles, and the telltale digital signatures of launch authorization nodes. Thermal imagery tracked which tunnel entrances breathed warm air at night and which were empty decoys. Acoustic analysis identified vehicle movement near cliffs that otherwise looked abandoned. Human reporting, remote sensing, and pattern-of-life analysis converged on a short list of critical objectives: a command bunker coordinating several anti-ship sectors, 2 hardened launch complexes hidden in coastal folds, mobile missile staging areas near the strait's northern arc, underground fuel and oxidizer stores, and a communications hub that tied local commanders to broader IRGC naval response elements. The plan that emerged was brutally simple in concept and ferociously complex in execution. Blind, isolate, penetrate, destroy, exploit, disappear. No prolonged occupation. No symbolic flag raising. No drifting firefight. Every minute after first contact increased the odds of regional escalation, mass missile release, or maritime retaliation. So the assault had to hit like a blade, not a hammer. Key sites had to be neutralized almost simultaneously. Defenders had to be denied the time needed to reconstitute a firing picture. And the force on the ground had to move through the target set with the certainty of men already leaving before the enemy had fully arrived. The approach began in layers of silence. Offshore, destroyers and submarines held firing solutions but did not yet speak. High above, surveillance aircraft watched the coast through darkness, measuring changes in light, heat, and movement. Closer in, unmanned systems slipped ahead of the manned force, drawing the map one last time. Along the maritime axis, low-signature craft and insertion platforms rode the black water toward release points that had been calculated down to current drift and moon angle. In the air, helicopters approached at masking altitude, using terrain and the coastline's broken geometry to stay hidden as long as physics allowed. To the men inside them, the world was reduced to red-lit cabin space, checked weapons, gloved hands, and the flat focus that arrives when rehearsal gives way to consequence. The first undeniable sign of attack was not a bomb. It was absence. Radars that should have been talking fell silent. Cameras that should have been feeding command posts froze. Backup circuits activated and then died beneath an unseen surge of intrusion and jamming. Iranian operators reached for alternate channels and found them crowded with phantom returns, false bearings, and clipped fragments of commands that seemed to come from authentic sources half a sector away. At 2 launch sites, crews began dispersal drills too early, exposing vehicles before higher headquarters could confirm the threat. At another, a tunnel gate remained closed because the unit commander believed the alarm was still an electronic deception. That hesitation cost them everything. Then the kinetic phase arrived all at once. Precision strikes hammered radar heads, relay masts, air defense nodes, and gate structures in carefully timed succession. Not enough to flatten entire districts, but enough to open the skin of the network. Seconds later, the ground force entered the wound. Marine raider assault teams hit outer compounds with disciplined violence, cutting through security positions before defenders could organize overlapping fire. Delta elements went for the brainstems, command posts, signal rooms, hardened entrances, key officers, and the small chambers where decisions could still be made under pressure. Breaching charges flashed in coastal darkness like white camera bulbs. Suppressed fire gave way to short, savage bursts. Doors disappeared. Hallways became kill funnels. Generators coughed out. The missile belt, built for endurance against air campaigns, was being dismantled from inside its own protected spaces. Across the wider target area, the operation moved faster than the defenders' ability to narrate it to themselves. A mobile launcher convoy attempting to relocate from a concealed staging point was caught between ruined road sections and overhead surveillance, then destroyed before it could fan out. A coastal battery on elevated ground managed to prepare one firing rail, only to lose its power, targeting feed, and crew shelter within moments of each other. Near a tunnel complex believed to house anti-ship missiles intended for the Strait's central transit corridor, assault teams discovered that the facility was deeper and better stocked than analysts had expected. Crates of guidance assemblies, spare transporter erector components, fueling equipment, hardened blast petitions. It was not just a launch site. It was a sustainment node, a place meant to keep the threat alive after the first exchange. That discovery shifted the tone of the raid. What had begun as a high-speed neutralization suddenly exposed a larger strategic reality. These were not isolated batteries waiting for orders. They were pieces of a resilient war reserve built to absorb punishment and keep firing through chaos. Inside one bunker complex, exploitation teams recovered maps, encrypted storage devices, launch sequencing materials, and sector diagrams showing fallback dispersal zones along the coast. In another chamber, they found communications equipment linking local missile units to IRGC naval fast attack elements and drone reconnaissance detachments. The defenders had planned for disruption. They had not planned for their plans to be seized in the middle of the opening strike. Outside, the tempo became apocalyptic. Secondary explosions started rolling through fuel points and ammunition storage cells. The night sky over parts of the coast pulsed orange and then white as confined blasts vented outward through concrete mouths and ventilation shafts. One mountain-facing facility, hit first at the entrance and then deeper within by follow-on fires guided from teams on the ground, seemed to inhale before erupting in a column of debris and incandescent dust. Nearby personnel who survived the initial shock staggered into a landscape they no longer recognized. Communications dead, vehicles burning, the chain of command reduced to rumor. Enemy confidence did not merely crack. It atomized. And still the clock kept ruling everything. 35 minutes. That was the brutal arithmetic of the mission window. Every team knew where it had to be by minute 10, minute 18, minute 26. Delay in one sector risked exposure in another. So the assault remained disciplined even at peak violence. Sites that could be rendered inoperable were disabled. Sites that contained intelligence were exploited with ruthless speed. Individuals deemed critical, technical officers, command personnel, liaison figures, were identified, secured where possible, or neutralized if resistance continued. No one lingered for theatrics. No one mistook destruction for freedom of time. The operation was not trying to conquer terrain. It was trying to erase capability. The climax came when the deepest objectives were hit almost simultaneously. At the principal coastal command bunker, charges placed on structural choke points collapsed key corridors and sealed portions of the facility inward. A nearby communications hub suffered cascading failure as its power backbone and relay architecture were destroyed in sequence, severing several subordinate sectors from real-time coordination. Farther east, hidden launch infrastructure near the Strait's approach points was detonated so violently that blast plumes were visible from shipping lanes beyond the immediate combat area. In the space of minutes, the integrated picture Iran had built to threaten one of the world's most critical waterways was no longer a shield or a sword. It was wreckage, scattered orders, and isolated survivors trying to call dead networks. Then, just as quickly, the force began to withdraw. Extraction in a raid like this is where discipline defeats ego. The temptation in success is always to do one more thing, search one more room, hunt one more target. But elite units survive because they obey the clock more than their adrenaline. As fires continued to consume selected facilities, assault teams peeled away by pre-planned routes toward pickup zones and maritime exfiltration corridors. Wounded were moved with controlled urgency. Sensitive equipment was accounted for. Demolition confirmations were passed in clipped, exact language. Helicopters returned low and fast, rotors beating over burning coastlines. Offshore craft absorbed exfiltrating teams under blackout conditions. Above them, Overwatch remained poised to punish any organized pursuit. But there was little pursuit to speak of. Shock had done what firepower alone often cannot. It had stolen the enemy's ability to react in time. Behind the departing force, the battlefield settled into a grim geometry of ruin. Tunnel entrances collapsed inward. Launch rails lay twisted under soot and fractured concrete. Command rooms that had once supervised maritime threat sectors were silent except for alarms running on dying backup power. Along the coast, surviving IRGC personnel were left confronting the most dangerous realization any military formation can face: that its hardened infrastructure, its redundancies, its carefully prepared confidence had all been penetrated in one compressed cycle of violence. Not held at risk. Not deterred. Penetrated. By sunrise, the strategic consequences were already radiating outward. Shipping companies, intelligence services, and defense ministries across the region were forced into immediate reassessment. If key missile sites near the Strait could be neutralized in under an hour, then the presumed durability of Iran's coastal denial network had been publicly and catastrophically called into question. Gulf states would read the strike one way, proof that the maritime noose could be cut before it tightened. Tehran would read it another, evidence that fixed prestige assets and command architecture had become liabilities under modern surveillance and precision warfare. Washington, in this fictional scenario, would likely say little in the opening hours, only enough to shape deterrence, not enough to narrate method. But silence after an operation can be more intimidating than triumph. It suggests reserves. It suggests options still untouched. And yet the aftermath would not be simple victory. No operation at this scale near the Strait of Hormuz ends in neat applause. Oil markets would convulse. Regional proxies would posture. Missile forces not struck in the initial raid would disperse further inland. Diplomatic channels would ignite with accusation, warning, and strategic ambiguity. Every capital from Riyadh to Brussels to Beijing would begin calculating second-order effects: shipping premiums, naval escorts, retaliatory ladders, cyber spillover, militia activation, domestic pressure, alliance credibility. The raid may have destroyed launchers, bunkers, and command nodes. It did not destroy geography. The strait would remain what it has always been, a narrow place where local firepower can rattle global systems. That is why operations like this enter military legends so quickly. Not because they are clean, not because they solve history, but because for a brief span of minutes, enormous structures of fear and deterrence are reduced to human decisions made under darkness. A pilot holding low over black water. A raider stack outside a steel door. A Delta team leader counting down a breach in a tunnel where radio traffic dies against stone. An operator marking a target that, if missed, may change the next decade. Grand strategy may fill the maps afterward, but in the decisive window, history narrows to breath, timing, and violence controlled with almost inhuman restraint. In this fictional telling, the number that would echo afterward was 35. 35 minutes to rupture years of defensive preparation. 35 minutes to blind sectors that had watched the strait for decades. 35 minutes to turn missile sanctuaries into furnaces and command sites into sealed tombs. For the men on the ground, it would not feel mythic at all. It would feel technical, loud, disorienting, and unfinished. Raids end physically long before they end psychologically. The body leaves, the images remain. And those images would remain for the region as well. Burned cliffside apertures above dark water. Radar masts collapsed like snapped reeds. Concrete mouths still breathing smoke into morning light. Charred transporter vehicles abandoned at angles that suggested panic rather than plan. Tankers in the transit lanes creeping forward under escort as if the sea itself no longer trusted the coastline. Somewhere inland, replacement commanders would already be trying to rebuild the chain. Somewhere offshore, planners would already be measuring what had been learned, what had been exposed, and what retaliatory patterns might come next. Warfare in the Gulf has always been a contest between permanence and interruption. One side builds hardened certainty. The other proves it can vanish. So the story does not really end with the last helicopter lifting away or the last bunker collapsing into itself. It ends where all serious geopolitical stories end, in uncertainty. In the knowledge that a destroyed missile base can be photographed, mapped, and counted, but a humiliated state cannot be so easily measured. The coast can be cratered in one night. The consequences move for years. Every shattered site becomes a message. Every silent radar becomes an argument. Every ship that passes safely through the strait after such a strike does so under the shadow of what had to be done to keep it moving. And over the Strait of Hormuz, where dawn always arrives without caring who bled in darkness, the sea would look calm again. That is the deception of chokepoints. They seem timeless from a distance. But underneath that calm, the memory of force lingers like pressure under stone. Men rebuild. Networks reroute. Doctrine adapts. Revenge matures. Somewhere in the hills above the water, smoke would still be lifting from broken launch tunnels while the first briefings began in capitals far away. The maps would change. The speeches would come. The warning would remain. Because in the end, the most terrifying part of a raid like this is not the explosion. It is the demonstration. The proof that even the hardest fortress on a strategic shoreline can be entered, dismembered, and left burning before the sun is fully up. And once that proof exists, it never disappears. It waits, quiet, remembered, and merciless, like a second coastline behind the first.